At 2:14 in the morning, the fluorescent lights of Bay 6 flickering the way they always do, on a Tuesday shift nobody staffs enough nurses for, my mother was bleeding out on a gurney in my emergency room, her blood pressure reading 68/40, on a monitor I have read 10,000 times in 12 years of trauma medicine, and the last time she had spoken to me, 5 years earlier, in a room that smelled like carnations and cheap floor wax, she had told me she could not stomach a deserter anymore. My name is Major Sarah Gibson, United States Army Reserve, 12 years of service, 4 of them classified, and that night the charge nurse looked at my own sister and said the only sentence that mattered. Major Gibson is the trauma chief. If you are watching this from a hospital break room, a barracks, or your car in a parking lot after a shift nobody thanked you for, comment where you are watching from right now, and if you have ever been underestimated by the people who were supposed to know you best, hit like and subscribe before this story does something to your chest that you were not ready for tonight. 3 things were happening at once that morning, and none of them had finished happening yet. The first was a courtroom, 11 days away, where my ex-husband's attorney was preparing to argue that a woman who abandoned her own father's deathbed to play soldier had no business raising our son alone. The second was a marriage that had ended not with a scream, but with a signature, 2 years earlier, on a night I will describe exactly because I remember the temperature of the pen in my hand. The third was a sealed manila envelope sitting in a Judge Advocate General's office in Fort Bragg, stamped with a classification I am only now, in this telling, permitted to describe, and it had been sitting there since the week my father died, waiting for someone to ask the right question. Each of those threads had a physical object attached to it. The courtroom had a custody petition with my son's photograph stapled to the corner. The marriage had a folded flag my ex-husband kept in a closet he no longer let me open. And the envelope, the one that would end everything, had my rank and serial number typed on the front in a font that had not changed since 1987. 5 years before that night, I was 31 years old, a captain then, stationed on paper at Womack Army Medical Center, and off the record, embedded with a forward surgical team, attached to a Joint Special Operations Task Force, whose name I still cannot say out loud in a video. My father, Robert Gibson, a retired postal supervisor with a heart that had been failing since I was in college, went into cardiac arrest on a Tuesday in March, while I was 70 hours into an operation I could not leave, could not call about, and could not explain. I remember the last real conversation I had with him, 2 weeks before, on a scratchy satellite line that cut out every few seconds, him telling me the azaleas had come in early that year, me telling him I was fine, both of us lying about how much we understood of what the other one's life actually looked like. That was the last full sentence my father ever said to me. Azaleas. I think about that word more than I think about almost anything else from that year. My mother, Diane, called my cell phone 4 times. It went to a number that did not ring where she thought it rang. My sister Claire, 2 years older than me, a paralegal in Charlotte who has spent her whole life measuring her worth against mine, in ways I never asked her to, drove 90 minutes to the hospital and sat with our father alone while he died at 4:52 in the afternoon, and I was not there, and for the next 5 years, that single fact became the only fact my family remembered about me. Not the 12 years of service, not the 2 deployments, not the trauma fellowship I completed on top of an active military obligation, sleeping 4 hours a night for 18 months. Just, she was not there. My mother stood over my father's closed casket 3 days later, and in front of 40 relatives, in a voice that did not shake, because she had already decided this was truth and not grief, said the sentence I will hear until the day I die. I cannot stomach a deserter anymore. My own father's funeral, and that was my eulogy. I remember the funeral home smelled like carnations and floor polish, a smell I still cannot walk past in a grocery store without my chest tightening, and I remember the exact chair I was sitting in, 3rd row, aisle seat, my dress uniform pressed and untouched in a garment bag in my car, because nobody had told me there would be a moment where I'd wish I'd worn it. I did not correct my mother in that room. I have replayed that decision 10,000 times since, whether silence was strength or cowardice, and I still do not have a clean answer, only the fact that I sat very still, the way I had been trained to sit still through worse things than a lie, and let it stand. What none of them knew, because I was not permitted to tell them, was that the operation I was running that week was a mass casualty response to an attack on a coalition outpost. 17 wounded in 9 hours, and I was the only general surgeon within 400 miles, with current trauma privileges and a security clearance high enough to be inside the wire. I made a decision that week that I have never regretted and have paid for every day since. I chose the 17 men bleeding in front of me over the one phone call I was not allowed to make. I do not tell people this story for sympathy. I tell it because 6 months later, when I filed for emergency leave to attend the memorial my mother rescheduled without asking me, my request was denied by a bureaucratic administrative error that took the army 4 months to correct, and by the time the correction came through, my mother had already told every person in 3 counties that her daughter chose a career over her own father's deathbed, and no piece of paper, however true, moves as fast as a rumor at a Southern funeral reception. My husband at the time, Mark Doyle, sold commercial insurance out of an office in Fayetteville, and when I met him, he liked telling people his wife was in the army, said it like a fact about himself, wore it at dinner parties like a lapel pin, would raise his glass at client dinners and say, half joking, half not, "My wife could probably field dress every man at this table," and everyone would laugh, and he would glow a little in the reflected light of it, the way people do when they've found a story about themselves that costs them nothing to tell. But Mark's affection for the idea of a soldier wife evaporated the exact week that being married to a soldier cost him something. He did not come to the funeral either. Technically, he came late, sat in the back, and left before the reception. But he was there enough that nobody blamed him, because a wife's absence is a betrayal, and a husband's is just a schedule conflict. That double standard is the quietest kind of cruelty, and I noticed it even through the fog of that year, filed it away, the way I file away vital signs I cannot act on yet. 3 years into our marriage, my son Ethan was born, 7 pounds 2 ounces, born on a Sunday, while I was on a 72-hour training rotation, that Mark told the delivery room nurses I had chosen to miss, when in fact, my emergency leave request had been approved and then lost in a paperwork transfer between 2 different personnel offices, a detail Mark knew and never corrected, because the story where I abandoned my own son's birth served him better than the truth. I did not learn he had let that story spread for 2 years, until Claire repeated it back to me at a Thanksgiving table, like an established fact, and by then, it had calcified into the family record, unquestioned, the same way a scar calcifies into skin. What I remember of Ethan's actual birth, the version nobody else got to keep, is the fluorescent hum of a field hospital recovery tent, a satellite call patched through by a communications sergeant who broke 2 regulations to get me 11 minutes on the line, and the sound of my son crying for the first time, through a connection so thin I had to press the receiver hard enough against my ear to leave a mark, while 800 miles away, my mother-in-law was already telling the delivery nurse a story about a wife who had chosen not to come. The paperwork trigger arrived on a Tuesday, mailed to the small rental house I moved into after the divorce, a plain envelope from the Cumberland County Family Court, and inside it was a motion for modification of custody, filed by Mark's attorney, a woman named Vanessa Cole, who specialized, according to her firm's own website, in cases involving military parents with demonstrated absenteeism. I read that phrase 4 times, standing in my own kitchen at 11 o'clock at night, still in scrubs from a 14-hour shift, and something in me went very still and very cold, the same stillness I feel when a trauma bay doors open and I have 4 seconds to decide who I operate on first. The motion cited my father's funeral. It cited Ethan's birth. It cited 19 separate call-outs and deployments over 6 years, presented as a pattern of a mother who prioritizes career advancement over parental presence, and attached to the motion, as an exhibit, was a sworn statement from my own mother, Diane GIBSON, stating under oath that her daughter had, in her words, a documented history of choosing absence at the moments that mattered most. My mother had signed a legal document, under penalty of perjury, using the same accusation she'd delivered at my father's funeral, and handed it to the man who had let a false story about my son's birth circulate unchallenged for 2 years. That was the moment Lupe opened all the way, no longer a rumor at a family dinner, but a weapon inside a courtroom, aimed at the one relationship in my life that mattered more than my own reputation. The pre-trial discovery period gave me 90 days, and I spent the first 30 of them doing nothing but working, because that is what I do with fear. I put on gloves, and I make it useful somewhere else. But on day 31, my attorney, a man named Colonel Daniel Reyes, retired GAG, silver-haired, unhurried, precise in a way that made opposing counsel visibly uncomfortable within the first 10 quiet minutes of any deposition, sat across from me in his Fayetteville office and asked one question that changed the shape of everything. "Sarah, what exactly were you doing the week your father died?" I told him I could not say. He asked if I had ever formally requested my own service record be reviewed for declassification in a civil proceeding. I told him I did not know that was possible. He opened a drawer, pulled out a form I had never seen, Department of Defense Form 1879, Request for Release of Classified Information for Judicial Proceedings, and said, "This is the envelope that ends this case. We are going to ask for it, and it is going to take time, and until it arrives, they are going to make you look exactly like the woman your mother swore you were." That envelope became the concrete object at the center of everything that followed, sitting on Colonel Reyes's desk in a manila folder marked pending, a folder I looked at every single time I walked into that office for the next 11 weeks, the way another person might look at a locked door they were told not to open yet. While the request moved through channels I could not accelerate, no matter how many calls I made. My mother-in-law by marriage in all but paperwork, Linda Doyle, Mark's mother, began a campaign of her own, a slower and more social kind of warfare. Linda had never liked me, not from the first Christmas, and her dislike had always worn the same specific costume, moral superiority delivered with a smile. At Ethan's 5th birthday party, 6 weeks before the custody hearing, held at Mark's house because the modification motion had temporarily restricted overnight visitation pending review, Linda cornered me by the dessert table and said, loud enough for 3 other mothers to hear, "It must be hard, coming to a party for a child you barely raised." I said nothing. I have trained myself for 15 years not to react in the first 4 seconds of any crisis, and I applied the same discipline to a folding table covered in cupcakes as I would to a trauma bay, because Linda Doyle, I understood clearly, was not actually talking to me. She was performing for the room, building a chorus, and every unchallenged sentence became one more witness she could call later. 2 weeks after that, at a school pickup, Linda repeated a version of the same line to Ethan's teacher, framed as concern. "His mother's job keeps her away so often. We just want to make sure someone consistent is watching him." Consistent, that word again, always aimed at the exact bruise my family had spent 5 years pressing on. I stood in that carpool line in my scrubs, 20 minutes late, because a gunshot wound had come through my doors at shift change, and I watched Ethan's teacher's face rearrange itself into the specific, practiced sympathy of someone who has just been handed a narrative and believes she is being kind by accepting it. I did not correct Linda in front of my son. I have a rule about that, one I built the hard way: never let a 5-year-old watch adults perform a war over his head. I saved my correction for rooms where he wasn't in the audience, and Linda, who understood that rule about me better than she understood almost anything else, used it against me every single time, because she knew exactly which rooms I would stay silent in. Vanessa Cole, the attorney, operated on a different frequency entirely, calculating rather than emotional, and her specific cruelty was procedural. She filed 3 separate motions in 6 weeks, each one technically minor, each one requiring my attorney's time and my money to answer. A strategy Colonel Reyes told me plainly, and repeatedly was designed to exhaust me before the hearing date, rather than to actually win any individual motion. In one deposition, Vanessa asked me, on the record, court reporter typing every word, to describe in detail what I was doing on the specific dates of 19 absences from Ethan's life, knowing full well I would answer most of them with, "That information is classified," and knowing that answer, repeated 19 times into a transcript, would read on paper like evasion, like a woman hiding behind rank, instead of a woman bound by law. "The court doesn't care about your clearance level, Major," she said to me once, not unkindly, which was somehow worse than if she had been cruel about it. "The court cares about a 5-year-old boy who needs his mother home for dinner." I wrote that sentence down when I got back to my car. I still have it in my phone, not because it broke me, not really, because it was, on its own honest terms, not entirely wrong, and the only thing standing between that sentence winning and losing was a sealed envelope still sitting in an office at Fort Bragg. In a second deposition, 3 weeks later, Vanessa produced a printed calendar, color-coded, marking every date I had missed a school event, over 6 years in red ink, 41 dates total, laid out across the conference table, like a chart of a disease. She asked me to explain, one by one, the first 11, knowing I could answer maybe 4 of them without invoking classification, and by the 9th date, a Tuesday I had spent hand-ligating a femoral artery in a triage tent, while the rest of the world went on eating breakfast, I stopped answering with words at all, and simply said, "That information is protected," 9 times in a row, and I watched the court reporter's hands never once slow down, typing my silence into a permanent record that would read, out of context, exactly like guilt. My sister Claire's cruelty was the quietest and somehow cut the deepest, because Claire had access to a version of me nobody else at that table had, 28 years of shared childhood, and she chose, every time, to use it against me instead of for me. At a deposition prep meeting, Vanessa's office requested with family witnesses present, Claire testified, under oath, that growing up I had always been the one who needed to be the hero, even when nobody asked her to be, reframing a lifetime of overachievement as a character flaw, reframing trauma surgery as ego. When Colonel Reyes asked her directly, on the record, whether she had any evidence Ethan was unsafe or neglected in my care, Claire said, "I don't know what she does when nobody's watching. Nobody ever really knew what Sarah did." That sentence, "Nobody ever really knew what Sarah did," would return to me later, in a different room, wearing a very different meaning. But on the day she said it, in a beige conference room, with a court reporter's keys clicking under her words, it landed exactly where she wanted it to land, like a scalpel finding the one gap in a suture line. I remember the specific detail of that room, the water stain shaped like Florida on the ceiling tile above Claire's head, the way she kept her hands folded on the table the entire time, the way she did not once look at me while she spoke, only at Vanessa, as though she were auditioning for a part, rather than testifying about her own sister. Afterward, in the parking garage, Claire caught up to me at my car and said, "Quieter. Off the record this time. You always made the rest of us look like we weren't trying hard enough." And I understood then that this had never really been about Ethan at all, that I had been carrying the weight of my sister's own unfinished comparison to me, since we were children sharing a bedroom, and that the custody case had simply given her a legal venue to finally say it out loud. At roughly 30% into all of this, sitting in my car outside the courthouse after a pre-trial hearing that had gone nowhere good, I made myself say something out loud to the dashboard, and I am going to say it to you now instead. If you have ever sat in a parking lot after being made small by people who were supposed to protect you, and you kept your hands on the wheel and did not cry until you got home, hit subscribe right now, because the next part of this story is for you specifically, not for the algorithm, for you. The custody hearing was scheduled for a Thursday. The Tuesday before it, Colonel Reyes called me at 6:40 in the morning, and his voice had a register I had never heard from him, something close to relief wearing the shape of professional calm. The Department of Defense had approved the declassification request. Not fully, but enough. A redacted operational summary confirming that Captain Sarah GIBSON, my rank at the time, had been the lead trauma surgeon of record during a documented mass casualty event spanning the exact 70-hour window of my father's death, along with a sworn declaration, already signed. From a retired brigadier general named Thomas Okafor, the officer who had personally commanded that entire operation, stating under solemn oath that Captain GIBSON's absence from any civilian communication during that window had been a direct and unavoidable result of active combat trauma response, ordered and confirmed by this command. The envelope, the concrete object I had watched sit untouched on a desk for 11 weeks, had a name and a rank inside it that outranked every accusation my family had ever made, and it had been sitting there the entire time, waiting only for someone to file the right form. I drove to Colonel Reyes's office that same morning, still in my scrub top from a night shift, and he laid 3 documents on the table between us, like a surgeon laying out instruments before an incision. The operational summary, 22 lines long, most of it still blacked out in thick redaction bars. General Okafor's declaration, 4 paragraphs, signed and notarized, and a cover letter from the Department of the Army confirming the release had been approved under an exception specifically carved out for family court proceedings involving minor children. "This is not everything that happened that week," Reyes told me, tapping the redaction bars. "But it's enough to end this case, and sometimes enough is the only mercy the law is built to give you." I sat in his office for 11 minutes without saying anything, staring at my own name typed in a government font, and I understood, maybe for the first time in 5 years, that the truth had been sitting in a filing cabinet the entire time, patient, unbothered, waiting for someone to finally ask, the way a stopped clock keeps the correct time twice a day, and nobody notices until they need it to. But paperwork alone does not undo 5 years of a family's chosen story, and I still had to walk into that story one more time before the hearing, on the Wednesday night before, when Mark called me, not to fight, which almost undid me more than fighting would have. He asked to see Ethan's science fair project one more time before the hearing, and when I brought Ethan to the door, Mark looked at me for a long moment and said, quietly, in a voice with none of Vanessa's calculation and none of his mother's performance in it, "I let this go too far." I know some of what my mother said isn't true. I let it stand because it made things easier for me. I did not forgive him in that doorway. I want to be honest about that, because this is not a story where forgiveness arrives on schedule. I said, "You'll have a chance to say that under oath tomorrow, if you mean it." And I took my son home, and I did not sleep that night. Not because I was afraid anymore, but because for the first time in 5 years, I could feel the shape of the truth finally standing up straight, where it had been bent sideways for so long. I did not sleep more than 90 minutes that night, and when I finally gave up trying, I stood in Ethan's doorway at 4 in the morning and watched him sleep the way I used to watch wounded men stabilize on a gurney, counting breaths, needing the rhythm of it to slow my own pulse down. I pressed my dress blues that morning for the first time in 5 years, the same uniform that had sat untouched in a garment bag since my father's funeral, and standing in front of the mirror buttoning it, I thought about the version of myself who had chosen not to wear it to that funeral, and I made a different choice this time. The fabric still smelled faintly of the cedar closet it had hung in, and the rank insignia caught the bathroom light in a way that made my hands, for just a moment, unsteady in a way nothing in a trauma bay had managed to do in over a decade. The morning of the hearing, Cumberland County Family Court, Judge Patricia Marsh presiding, the gallery was fuller than any custody hearing I had ever heard of, because Colonel Reyes had quietly informed 3 retired officers from my old unit, and word travels fast in that world. And so the back rows held men and women in civilian clothes, who had once called me Doc, sitting beside my aunt, my cousin, 2 nurses from my ER who took a day of unpaid leave to be there, and Linda Doyle, sitting stiffly in the front row beside Mark, who would not look at her. Vanessa Cole opened with her strongest material, the 19 absences, my mother's sworn statement, Claire's deposition testimony, read into the record in her own words. Nobody ever really knew what Sarah did, and I watched the sentence land on the judge's face, exactly the way it had landed everywhere else for 5 years, as suspicion dressed up as concern. Then Colonel Reyes stood, walked to the evidence table, and did not raise his voice, because he never does, and he entered into evidence a redacted Department of Defense operational summary and a sworn declaration from Brigadier General Thomas Okafor, and he asked the court's permission to read one paragraph aloud. Judge Marsh granted it. The paragraph confirmed the mass casualty event, confirmed my role as lead surgeon, confirmed the exact 70-hour window, and confirmed, in General Okafor's own sworn words, that during that window, I had personally performed emergency surgery on 11 wounded service members, 3 of whom, the declaration specifically noted, are alive today because of decisions I made inside that window. My family spent 5 years calling desertion. Judge Marsh read the declaration herself, silently, for almost a full minute, the only sound in that courtroom the shuffle of Vanessa Cole's papers, as she realized, visibly, that the ground under her strongest exhibit had just been declassified out from under her. Then Judge Marsh looked up, first at my mother, seated 3 rows back, and then at Claire, and said the sentence that closed the loop my mother had opened at my father's casket 5 years earlier. This court has heard testimony that nobody ever really knew what this woman did. The United States government just told us. She was saving lives while her family buried her reputation. Claire's own words, inverted, spoken back in a judge's calm, unhurried voice, in a room full of witnesses who would repeat this story for years, and I watched my mother's face do something I had not seen it do since the funeral, which was crumble, all at once, like something finally given permission to. I heard the specific sound the gallery made behind me, a collective exhale, a shifting of 40 bodies in wooden benches, and somewhere in the back row, one of the retired officers, a former staff sergeant I had operated beside in that same 70-hour window, said, "There it is," under his breath, quiet enough for the record, but loud enough for me to hear, and something in my chest that had been braced for 5 straight years, finally let go. Judge Marsh, unhurried, methodical, did not stop there. She addressed the sworn statement my mother had submitted directly, calling it, on the record, a perjurious characterization, submitted without any factual basis, based entirely on assumption dressed as certainty, and referred the matter to the district attorney's office for review of a possible perjury charge, a referral my mother's own attorney later negotiated down to a formal retraction, and a public correction filed with the court. But the words were said, in open court, in front of the same community that had watched her call me a deserter at a funeral. Vanessa Cole's motion was denied in full. Full physical and legal custody remained with me, unmodified, and Judge Marsh added a rare additional note to the order, stating that any future motion referencing my military service record without formal declassification review would be treated as bad faith litigation. Mark did not contest the ruling. When it was over, in the hallway outside the courtroom, he approached me alone, without Linda, without Vanessa, and said the sentence I had been waiting 5 years to hear from someone in that family. Not an apology exactly. Something more specific than that. I built a story about you, because it was easier than admitting I didn't understand you, and Ethan is going to grow up knowing the real one instead. In the weeks that followed, the consequences distributed themselves unevenly, the way real consequences do, never as clean as fiction wants them to be. Linda Doyle's social circle, the same women who had nodded along at the birthday party, quietly stopped inviting her to the Thursday bridge group, after 2 of them heard second-hand about the perjury referral. And Linda, I am told, has still never called to apologize directly, only routed a stiff acknowledgement through Mark at pickup, which I accepted for Ethan's sake, and let go of for my own. Vanessa Cole's firm, according to Colonel Reyes, quietly removed the phrase, military parents with demonstrated absenteeism, from its website within a month, replacing it with softer language about co-parenting evaluations. And 2 attorneys in that same courthouse have since referred me, informally, as a cautionary example when younger lawyers build a custody strategy around a parent's clearance level, a case study, Reyes told me with something close to grim satisfaction, that now gets mentioned in a continuing education seminar on military family law he occasionally teaches. Claire did not attend Ethan's next birthday. She sent a card, no letter, no explanation, and 3 months later called me on a Tuesday night and said only, "I didn't know what to do with how good you turned out to be at the thing I resented you for." Which is not an apology I have fully forgiven yet, and I want to be honest that I may never fully forgive it, because some doors close slowly and stay half open for a long time, and that is allowed. My mother wrote me a letter, 4 pages, handwritten, that I have read exactly once, and in it she said the sentence I had needed since I was 31 years old, standing outside a hospital tent I could not leave. I built a story to survive my own grief, and I used your absence because it was easier to be angry at you than at the God who took your father. I was wrong, and I am sorry it took a courtroom to make me say it. I have not written back yet. I don't know when I will. Some wounds do not owe anyone a fast healing schedule, not even the people who caused them and have since changed. I keep her letter in the same drawer where I keep my father's dog tags, not because I've made peace with either object yet, but because some things earn a place in a drawer, next to a folded flag and a set of dog tags gone slightly green at the edges, long before they earn a place in a real conversation. General Okafor, the man whose signature ended a 5-year war I never chose to fight, sent me a single line by email after he heard how the hearing had gone. No congratulations, just, told you those 17 men would matter to somebody eventually, Major. I have read that email more times than I'd like to admit, usually at 2 in the morning, usually in a break room, usually right after a shift where nobody thanked me either, and it still does the same thing to my chest every time, still catches somewhere between my ribs and my throat, still makes me stand very still for a second before I can go back to whatever chart I was charting. What I know now, standing in an ER at 2 in the morning, with my own mother's blood pressure dropping on a monitor, I have read 10,000 times, her hand finding mine for the first time in 5 years, while a resident calls for 2 units of O negative. Is that being underestimated does not make you smaller, it just makes the people underestimating you smaller, standing in a room they don't understand, calling the thing they cannot see fear, calling it absence, calling it desertion, when it was actually the exact opposite the entire time. My mother lived. It took 4 units of blood, an emergency laparotomy, and 11 minutes I will not describe in detail, because some rooms belong only to the people who were in them, but she lived. She is home now, slower, quieter, walking with a cane she resents more than she'll admit. And last week, she asked Ethan, for the first time in his life, to tell her a story about his mother, the surgeon, and he told her about the day I let him wear my old field jacket to school for show and tell, sleeves rolled up 4 times over, my name tape still stitched above the pocket, and how his classmates had asked him what Madge Gibson meant, and he'd told them, proudly, "That's my mum, she saves people," and my mother cried, quietly, in a way I had never once seen her cry, not at the funeral, not at the hearing, and I let her, because some grief is just love that arrived on the wrong schedule, 5 years and 1 gunshot quiet hospital room, too late, but not too late to matter, not anymore. If someone in your life has ever decided who you are, based on what they could not see, filed you away under a word that was never true, deserter, absent, missing, gone, what would it take for them to finally look, really look, past the version of you that was easiest for them to believe, and would you even want them to anymore, after everything it cost you to stand up straight without their permission? The charge nurse never did stop calling me Major Gibson after that night. Not once, not even off shift, and I remember the exact way the trauma bay went quiet for half a second when she said it in front of my sister, the monitors still beeping, the smell of iodine and cold saline in the air, my mother's blood pressure finally climbing back into a number I could work with. Claire stood against the wall the entire time I worked, silent, and I did not have the bandwidth that night to notice what was on her face until much later, replaying it in my head on the drive home at 6 in the morning, and what I finally recognized in her expression was not relief. It was recognition, 5 years too late, the exact look of someone finally seeing a person they had spent half a decade deciding not to see. 3 floors up, in a room with better lighting and worse coffee, there was another envelope waiting for me the following Monday, This one from a different courthouse entirely, in a different county, with a different name typed across the top, that I have not told a single person in my family about yet. And if you want to know what was inside it, and why it changed everything I thought I understood about the word deserter, you already know what to do before the next video starts. Because if you made it this far, you've already proven you're the kind of person who finishes what they start.